This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Quiet Riot. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Quiet Riot's Poll the Other One. And it's going to be a two-parter, so you're currently listening to part one. My name's Naomi, and I'm very nosy. I enjoy little more than commissioning questions of the general public, snooping on a focus group, and analysing all of the results. And so I thought we could record a special episode, but actually it's going to be two, with industry insiders to talk about the trends in public opinion to look out for in 2025, what the pollsters are doing to get things more right than wrong, and to answer some of your questions. And our Ko-Fi backers get access to exclusive Discord channel where they can chat with like-minded Quiet Rioters, leave us feedback, and help co-create episodes like this one. And I asked our backers what they wanted to know about polling, and I'm going to throw their questions at two friends of the show who are both at the top of the polling game. And in part one, in this episode, I'm going to be talking to Director of More in Common, Luke Tryl, and he's going to talk us through everything that they're doing at that company with regards to next year, the trends they're going to be looking out for, how they do the polling that they do, and answering your questions. Part two will be out soon, and that's going to be with James Kanagasuriam. He's the guy who actually invented the phrase the red wall, and he is CRO at Focal Data, who are a brilliant polling company that at Best for Britain I've worked with for many, many years. So I hope you enjoy both shows. Here's part one. Don't forget to listen to part two when that comes out. Quiet Riot. Hello and welcome back to Luke Tryl, Director of More in Common, a regular feature on Quiet Riot. Luke, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I am starting to get into the festive spirit, which is good. We are putting out lots of Christmas-based polling at the moment, which I'm quite enjoying.
Ooh, anything you can share? Is there like a famous Christmas movie that most people are...
Yeah, well, and what I can do is we now know which political party leads amongst different favourite Christmas films. So the most Labour-leaning Christmas films are Elf and The Grinch. The Conservatives have a stonking lead amongst Love Actually fans, and the only film which has a Reform lead is Scrooged.
Who's backing Die Hard? Because that's my favourite Christmas movie.
Well, I mean, in that you have put yourself on the wrong side of public opinion by saying it is a Christmas film, because actually we asked that question, is Die Hard a Christmas film? 51% said no, 31% said yes, and 18% don't know. But among those who picked it as a favourite Christmas film, it was basically a dead tie between the Tories and Labour, 27-26.
Never say I'm not cross-party.
Exactly.
Let it never be said.
You are Middle England.
All right, look, Luke, More in Common was definitely one of the more accurate polling companies at the UK general election. And so I'd love to know what you put that down to. And I guess from my perspective, it's really interesting to consider whether the fact that you do so much qualitative work, not just the quant-heavy MRP style polling, that might have given you the edge.
Well, it's very kind of you to say. I think, well, starting with that, I was listening to a talk by Miranda Green recently, who some of listeners will know is an FT writer, always worth reading. And she was saying one of the things that she slightly lamented about polling and political polling was that it was becoming just a bit too sort of data heavy, in the sense that it was becoming almost an extension of data science rather than understanding that it's about political dynamics, it's about people, it's about places. And, she cited some of the kind of weirder results coming out of some of the MRPs. And it reminded me, and I was chatting with another pollster about this, someone very respected, a sort of dean of the polling lobby, who was saying that we've kind of lost the sense, I think, somewhere that this is about politics, and politics ultimately means that polling should always be, it is a science, but it's an art-informed science. And I think what the qual allows you to do is to sort of pick up different trends that the polling might be missing and to think about why that's not there in the model. And so two things which certainly helped with our polling and making it more accurate in the end was one was this might sound technical, but it's actually quite important. We weight separately for over 75s. So that means we treat them as a separate category.
That is really good to know, because I was having this conversation with my team earlier. The 65 and over feels like a whopping great big lump of people now that we are all living a lot longer, and many people living well into their 80s. That's a sort of bunch a 65-year-old and their views in with 85-year-olds feels wrong.
Oh, and look, if you look at the data, I think undoubtedly it is too much to lump that group together. And the particular area that it comes out, and this is, like every pollster, we overestimated Labour. But what we got basically spot on was the Conservative vote and the Reform vote. And part of the reason for that is if you look at the sort of age profile of Reform voters, it rises into late middle age, but then really falls off in that over 75 group, and the Tories come back up. So I am reasonably sure, and looking at the data, one of the reasons we didn't overestimate Reform, as many did, is because we have that weighting for over 75s. We treat them separately.
That's fascinating, because I remember during the referendum on Europe, people sort of lazily saying, older people voted to leave and the young people voted to remain. And the two things that stood out for me there was that actually when you really delved into the data, it looked like the very oldest voters who remembered World War II were actually quite pro-European by comparison to people even just a couple of years younger than them, and certainly the boomer generation. And then secondly, and John Curtis will tell you this ad nauseum, that age was not the correlator, it was education. And it just so happens that younger people tend to be more likely to have gone to university and have a degree than older people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, one of the pushbacks that you get from weighting over 75 separately is how representatives are your 75-year-olds who are answering online surveys. But I think if you now look at the data, basically since the pandemic, online and internet access and digital access for over 75 has ballooned. It's massive now. And so I think, it is a trade-off, but I think you get that better sample by looking at that group separately. And as I say, it was in part the qual which informed that. It was just this sense that these two group people just coming up to retirement and people who've been retired for a little while are not the same in their thinking. And the other thing which the qual helped us devise was undecided. So we had quite an advanced model to look at undecideds, because you remember in the run-up there was that big chunk of Tory
two years ago, or even 18 months ago, they were a very worryingly large group. I mean, I remember them sort of nudging upwards towards 20% at one point, and thinking, well, are these just shy Conservative or shy Reform voters, or are they genuinely undecided? And if so, why is that group so big?
Well, absolutely. And I remember the very good data that Best for Britain put out, where I think you actually modelled what would happen if a chunk of these voters went back home and the impact that it would have. And so one of the things we tried to do is to really get under the skin of where are these people going to go. And we created a model which basically said, look, if you have this demographic and this demographic, you say you're undecided, but actually you're probably going to vote Tory. Or actually looking at you, you're a bit like those grumpy Tories who say that they're going to stay at home. And of course, staying at home was one of the big lessons of the election. We know that around 3/4 of Tory voters who didn't vote in 2024, so they voted Tory in 2019, 3/4 of them, it was the first time that they hadn't voted. They weren't habitual non-voters. They were
Right.
sitting it out because they were so cross with the party that they would normally support having messed things up. And also they weren't scared of Keir Starmer. So they felt, you know what, I can sit this out.
Well, we'll get on to 2025 in a bit. But sticking with this year, was there anything that stood out for you in 2024 with regards to shifting attitudes about politics beyond the non-voter being a kind of new and first-time non-voter?
Well, I think the thing which and this isn't a particularly profound revelation, and you hinted at it on the pod before, but it's just the volatility of voters. I think there was a bit of an assumption that Labour would get its big majority, an assumption that they would get it on a slightly higher vote share, and that voters would sort of say, okay, you've got, one term, maybe 2 terms to sort of sort this out, but we'll give you a bit of benefit of the doubt. What we've seen very quickly is quite a stark fall, both in Keir Starmer's approval rating and in Labour's share in voting intention polls, which, to stress, on one level, sort of doesn't matter. We are a long way away from an election. Why are we obsessing about polls? But on the other hand, really does matter because it's pretty unprecedented to see that level of fall in support over such a short period of time. And I think it speaks to that kind of deep impatience and unhappiness in the electorate, who basically think they've been told since the financial crash, just one more set of tough decisions, one more set. And actually they're like, well, when do things start to get better? And yeah, as someone who studies this, it has really struck me. But on the other hand, and again, I think this comes back to your first question about the importance of the qual along with the quant, is you hear people in focus groups. One of the things I struggled with in focus groups throughout the election was we had this poll data back saying Labour were on course for, ours was around the low 40s. Some people kind of high 40s result in the election. And yet in the focus groups, people were like, well, I desperately want the Tories out, but I'm not really sure about anyone else, and I don't really like any politicians. And so, again, you picked up that mood of total discontent much more strongly in the qual than in the quant.
Fascinating. Quiet Riot. One thing that struck me when we think about big political moments of the year separately from the general election was, of course, the riots that happened in the summer, triggered by disinformation, misinformation about the ethnicity of the murderer of the little girls. And when we looked at who was rioting, quite a lot of them were in their middle age or even late age. I think one who was sentenced was actually even a pensioner. He was nearly 70. And typically, of course, we associate rioting with the younger generation, expressing their frustration over their life chances being reduced or, some other triggering event for them, maybe the murder of a young person by the police. Is this new cohort of rioting elderly people a group we need to be kind of much more worried about being radicalized by false online content?
What the riots showed was that, no one is immune from that. And it was, as you say, it was a spread of different age groups and people who were involved in the rioters. And yeah, I think for some people, images of people who were in late middle age or pensioners rioting was quite shocking. If you look at the sort of data on support for the riots, it continues to be a sort of, support is the wrong word, actually. If you look at people expressing sympathy with the rioters' cause or being more likely to say that the rioters speak for them, that continues to skew younger. So to give you an example, we asked in the midst or towards the end of the riots, do the rioters speak for you or do they not speak for you? And overall, 86% said that they didn't speak for them, 14% said that they did speak for them. But there were some age differences there. So in the 25 to 34 age group, the number saying the rioters spoke for them rose to 22%. So it was 8 points higher than the average. Whereas in that 55 to 64 cohort, it was down to 10%. So they are definitely there, but the age profile of people who were more likely to say the rioters speak for them, and indeed similar figures when you asked do they represent the views and concerns of ordinary Britons as well, tended still to skew younger.
So, Luke, when it comes to 2025, get your crystal ball out. What are the key trends in public opinion to be looking out for?
I am firstly interested in does the fragmentation persist? We are in a situation at the moment. Our last poll of the year has the Conservatives and Labour tied on 26%, Reform on 19%. Lib Dems and Greens further behind. But an unprecedented degree of electoral fragmentation. And I am interested to see, does that continue? For lots of reasons. I mean, under first past the post, those kind of splits could lead to some very strange results, particularly in council elections that are coming up. First past the post isn't designed to work when you have those kind of vote splits. Obviously, there is a lot of chat about how well Reform will do in general next year. As I say, I think Farage is going to be PM is a little bit premature. We have him on 19% in that poll, still behind the other two parties. And actually, we asked the public, do you think Reform will win the next general election? And only around a quarter think it is likely that they may win it. But I would keep an eye on that. But I'd also keep an eye on Labour's left. The challenge for Labour is not just that they risk losing votes to Reform or back to the Tories, but as we saw in the election, the Greens in particular, some of these independents, Corbyn's new party, pose a challenge as well. So they have to offer something to their progressive flank as well. And then I think, the inauguration of Donald Trump, foreign affairs isn't often top of people's mind, but does it change public opinion towards our relationship with Europe or America? What do people think about the war in Ukraine? I mean, it's interesting. Britain is one of the few countries where we have basically zero polarization on Ukraine. Whether you across political parties, people think it matters to Britain that Ukraine wins. Does that change? Do Brits support a peace deal if it's not favourable to Ukraine? I would keep an eye on foreign affairs. I think it's going to be increasingly important. And, is there any shift in that top three big issues? For the past few years, it has been cost of living, NHS, immigration. Does that shift at all? Does one go up? Does one go down? And can Labour be seen to get a grip, particularly on the NHS?
Interesting what you were saying about Nigel Farage potentially being overpriced to be the next Prime Minister as things stand. I was looking at the betting markets before I came on this interview with you, and he's now leading the betting markets as next Prime Minister. I think that, like you, that is probably overpriced at the moment. But where I think there is an underappreciation is when you look at the betting market for whether or not he will lead the Tory party, become the next leader of the Tory party. Do you sense that Conservative voters are shifting ever more in that direction since the election of Kemi Badenoch as leader?
I don't particularly. I mean, I think the challenge is there is a tendency to assume that Reform are basically more extreme Conservatives. And I think it's a bit of a misclassification, because if you look at the general election, your average Tory voter now is basically Philip Hammond. Your average Reform voter is much more sympathetic to Lee Anderson. They are not different sides of the same spectrum. They are quite different in their approach. And actually, I say this to people often and they go, look at the name. The Conservative Party exists to conserve. Reform exist to change the
Disrupt.
system.
Yeah.
And you see that on so many different questions. Ask about abolishing the House of Lords. Reform voters the most likely of any party, Conservatives the least likely of any party. Talk to reform voters in a focus group about big business, and they often sound like Corbynites. They're so skeptical, whereas Conservative voters much more likely to defend the role of business. So I think this has been slightly underpriced, that there is an incongruence there between the two parties. Now, there is a good group who, as we know, can flow between them, but it's for that reason that I think a merger is somewhat unlikely. And I have noticed in the past couple of days or this week that it seems like the Conservatives are becoming more willing to take the fight to reform. I've noticed Conservative MPs being more willing to talk it out. And I think up till now, there's been approaches, we mustn't say anything because we risk upsetting our voters who are sympathetic. Whereas now, I think there's a bit more, actually, we have to compete for votes with them. So I think it is somewhat unlikely that there is a formal sort of merger, but that does depend on what happens going forward. If the Conservatives can't recover back up to, low 30s, then maybe it becomes a sort of active proposition. But I just don't think it's as easy as some people say, given the differences between them.
Well, you touched on something that actually came up in a question from our Quiet Riot backers. So, Luke, I'm going to move you on to those now. And Martha asks whether horseshoe theory is becoming more of a thing. Are we seeing a convergence of those with left-wing economics but social conservatist views now more closely resemble some of the hard right? And you sort of touched on some reform voters having slightly more Corbynite views when it comes to big business. So, yeah, if you could let us know whether you are seeing a pattern that might give more credit to the horseshoe theory than we've seen previously.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. One of my favourite stats was when we looked at the very start of this year about who reform voters' second choice might be, was the surprisingly large number who said that they would pick the Greens. And it was basically, there is that sort of part of it is there is just an anti-system vote out there. It is people who want to say none of the above. They want to throw, like when you lose a game and you get very frustrated, you want to throw the board up in the air. I think, understandably, lots of people want to do that. So that's part of it. But it is also true that if you look at, we often talk about kind of, the centre ground and assume we're talking, median voter is Nick Clegg. Median voter is not Nick Clegg. It's quite unusual. Median voter in the UK is quite, left-leaning on the economy and reasonably authoritarian on social issues. It's, you could sort of characterise it as hang 'em, flog 'em, cane 'em and fund the NHS. So there is space there. And actually, one of the weird, maybe it's not weird, but it's one of the, I think, big mistakes that Reform have made is in some of their economic positioning and in some of their reaction to sort of more authoritarian public health measures. Because actually, the group who would be most likely to back Reform strongly supported lockdown restrictions, supported the vaccine, don't want libertarianism when it comes to the economy, quite statist climate measures, and agree with Reform on immigration. And so at the moment, the immigration bit outweighs the economy a bit. But if Reform were to grow, I think they would have to try and bring in some of that kind of more left economic thinking. And of course, in Germany now, you have the BSW party, which is pretty much running on that sort of platform. It's social conservatism and left-wing economics as well. So it would be...
and of course, they do have an election coming up, so we'll be keeping a close eye on that. Luke, lots of people want a bluffer's guide to MRP. What does it stand for? What is it? And what are its benefits and limitations?
Oh, it's a great question. And I'm glad listeners haven't got sick of MRP since the election. So MRP stands for multi-level regression with post-stratification. So what does that mean? What it means is we use data from a voting intention poll to basically work out how people will vote based on their demographics. That's the sort of multi-level regression part of it. So we will get that if you are a 55-year-old woman who voted for Brexit or and lives in a semi-detached house, you are likely to vote for the Conservative Party. What the post-stratification bit does is it then looks at how many of that group are in a particular constituency, and therefore what is the probability of that constituency voting for a political party. So that's what we do. You take we know that these groups vote like this, or are more likely than not to vote like this. How many of them are there in individual seats? And from that, you make constituency level projections.
Great. And so what would you say is useful and less useful about it?
So there is no doubt that MRPs allowed us to get closer to what the result was in terms of seats than using UNS, uniform swing, would have done, because they take into account those individual sort of demographics, and you can sort of see what's happening at a more granular level. And, I think our MRP, YouGov, Focal Data, JLP in particular, got reasonably close to what the final result was. Others were a bit more out, particularly on the Tory share. So it's good for that. Where is it less good? So some of the individual level predictions, John Curtis, for instance, would say he's only interested in the overall numbers you're giving for each party rather than predicting individual seats. And that's where a problem comes. It's not great at predicting, things like independents and how well they did. And they're, of course, part of the landscape now as well, or some of the smaller parties. And the great Patrick English at YouGov would always say, you need a lot of juice for them. Normally in a poll, if you go above 2,000, you're not adding that much. When people say mega poll and it's a normal VI poll, I'm like, well, 2,000 would get you there. For an MRP, you really need the numbers because it allows you to get to that level of granularity. So they're the three limitations. But it is, as I say, it proved in this election to be a better tool than your traditional swing.
Thank you. Ian wants to know about the accuracy differences between online polling and phone polling. He says that a lot of people think online surveys are incorrect, and that some of the blame for the polling miss here is down to that, but that in the US there is a lot more telephone polling that seemed to get closer to the final result. And therefore he asks, are online panels more liable to false results?
So if you look at the general election, that wasn't the case. The error was broadly equal across phone pollsters and online panels, which is quite interesting because I think there was a lot of speculation in the run-up that, when a phone poll came out, that it was more accurate than some of the online panels. I think the challenge is deeper than that. It is not simply an issue of phone or online. It is who is answering your survey ultimately. And yes, with online samples, we have the over-engagement problem can come out and how you correct for that. If you look at how some panels recruit, they will say, want to share your views about politics, join this panel. Now, clearly, that is going to get people who want to share their views about politics. Challenge, of course, with phone polling is who are you actually reaching? Who are you getting? Is that representative? So it's not as simple as phone versus online, but I think we all have to think quite carefully, particularly after this election, about our samples and our sample quality. And indeed, my view is that we would strengthen organisations like the British Polling Council if people were clear about which panel providers they use to get their samples from. I think that would really help with transparency. We are once a quarter now publishing our microdata What does that mean? It means we're publishing the sort of individual level responses, so you can go and play around and check our working.
Ooh. Oh, be still my beating heart, Luke.
Yeah, no. So please, please, listeners, do go on that, because I take this really seriously, and I think unless we are transparent, I don't want our polling to go the way it has in the US, where it is, just totally discredited by partisanship, and think taking more steps towards transparency and quality control is really important. It's worth noting as well that Varian, who had one of the best, most accurate poll in the election, used something like use what's called a random probability sample panel, where people can it's not opt-in the same way. It's people are selected for it. That may be a way around it, although that has downsides in terms of ability to get scale and cost. So it is something we are thinking a lot about, and the BPC, if listeners are interested, is now publishing each individual pollster's response to the polling error in July. And I'm sure some Quiet Riot listeners would like to go and have a look and see what we think, and we will try and do better in future.
Brilliant. Well, we'll leave a link to the British Polling Council website in the show notes. Luke, thank you so much for letting us plunder that big brain. Have a wonderful Christmas, and we look forward to having you back on Quiet Riot again many, many times in 2025.
I'm looking forward to joining you again in the new year.
Well, listeners, I hope you found this episode of Poll the Other One as interesting as I did. I thought Luke's analysis of the complementary role of qualitative and quantitative research was spot on, as the industry tries to improve its predictions and to get things a little bit more accurate than perhaps they have done in recent years. I can't wait to hear what James is going to talk about. That will be coming in part 2 soon, so do make sure that you're subscribed to the show so that you are alerted when that episode drops. And yeah, if we didn't cover something, Luke's going to be back on the show very, very soon, so you can ask him any question you'd like. You can email quietriotpod@gmail.com, and the next time he's on the show, we'll put his questions to you. But for now, I'll say farewell. I hope you're enjoying the festive period so far, and as I say, we'll be back with part 2 very soon. Bye.